Oh boy. When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
Good day. So now we get to actually start looking at some real work and talking about the pieces that you've been assigned in advance and had some time to work on. Before going through the rest of this video, there's one thing you need to make sure you've done, and that is turn in the homework on the Chopin preludes in E minor and A minor. And you can turn those in either by having PDFs that you email to me, or printing out the PDF files and scanning them and sending them to me, or even you can, print out your answers and just take a picture of the worksheet with your phone and email it to me. But you want to make sure you've handed in your homework before going through this video. So let's talk about the Chopin E minor prelude, which is a very wonderful piece of music. One of his more well-known pieces, a piece that people are really attracted to, and a good piece for us to study because it's got some treasures it's waiting to yield up. So the first thing I'd like to do is let's listen to the Chopin E minor prelude. So let's tackle a big picture issue about this piece first. Actually, and before we even do that, one thing I should call your attention to is that there is a typo. It's in the score that I sent you all to look at, but I didn't want to find a different edition since I'd already had you all do the work from this particular one. But it's worth noting that in that one measure, in the third line, third measure, that whoever did this particular edition forgot to change the chord back on the last two quarter notes there. Instead of having B and D sharp for the lowest notes, it should be C and E, just like in the measure before. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, and hopefully that's something that you heard when the recording played. As far as the big picture idea of this piece, I guess a big picture question we could ask about it is, what's the form? And it's a two-part form, and I think everybody can get that. You know, there's an A section that basically takes up the first 3 lines, and then there's a second section that takes up the last 3 systems. And that second section is very like the first section, so much that we wouldn't want to call this a binary A-B form, because the second section is not a B, is it? It's the same as A, just with some changes. This is a big A prime form. It's what we'd call a bipartite form, I guess, but the form of this piece isn't really the most important thing, the most compelling aspect of it. Instead, the thing that makes this piece so compelling and so much loved is something else. Let's see if we can get through to what that something else is. So what makes this piece so enjoyable? Now, a lot of times people talk about a good piece of music as being something that has a lovely melody. Well, you know, if you look at this piece and you look at its melody, I'm going to be a little bit judgy. And I'm going to say I don't think that the melody of this piece is that strong when we isolate it. It's rather static. You know, it just sort of knocks around B for the first 4 measures, and then it kind of knocks around A for the next 4 measures. And there's not a lot of variation to it. So, you know, the thing that makes this piece work isn't the melody in and of itself, although a lot of times if you like this piece and you're trying to remember it, you'll sort of find yourself humming the melody, but you're probably imagining the harmony underneath it when you do that, because when we add harmony to that static melody, things start to happen. It's better. I can't read the score that well, but these chords definitely make the piece have a little bit more meaning, don't they? It's really when you combine the harmony with the melody that this piece starts to come alive. So we might look and see, what is it about the harmony that really helps this melody to be the lovely thing it is? Well, let's go a little deeper. So this is definitely a piece where you need to put it through a harmonic analysis and figure out what the chords are. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. But you know, one question I did ask was, are there certain times where Chopin writes chords that create very strong expectations in us, only to then like not fulfill those expectations? So, you know, the answer is yes, or why would I ask that question? And in these first 2 systems, there are 2 good instances where that happens. One is at the end of the first system in the 4th measure. There's a chord that really sort of makes us crave something. That chord sets up a strong expectation. And the other chord that sets up a strong expectation is in the 2nd system in the 3rd measure. When I hear both of those chords, when I hear the one at the end of the first system or the one in the third measure of the second system, I expect a certain chord to follow, and I expect it because these chords are major minor seventh chords. And if you think back to us doing the Recovered Memories worksheet, one thing I mentioned was major minor seventh chords are so useful because they always sound like 5/7 chords. It's that chord that you can play and you can like imagine the tonic that it wants to resolve to. When I play this, it's not hard to think, oh, I could hear that chord going here real nicely. Likewise, in the second system, when I play this chord, you can imagine that chord going here. But neither chord does that. Instead, both of those chords that really make us expect things deny those expectations and go other places. That's what happens in the first line. And in the second line, you really expect that G chord to follow, but instead, we hear what sounds like D minor 7 before everything sort of muddles away and goes wherever Chopin goes from there. So both of those chords sort of let us down, and both of those chords, since they're major minor seventh chords, are things you'd want to think of as 5/7 chords. The one in the top system, it's an E7 chord, E, G sharp, B, D. It sounds like the 5/7 chord for an A chord. So if I'm in E minor, that'd be 5/7 of 4. But then the chord that comes after it definitely is not a 4 chord. And the chord on the bottom system is a D, F sharp, A, C chord. D7, which sounds like it should go to G, so that sounds like 5/7 of 3 in E minor. But the chord that comes after it is not 3. So we have two chords that we really expect to go somewhere, and then they don't go there. And they don't even resolve like deceptive resolutions. They just don't do what they're supposed to do. And there's a trick Chopin uses with both of those that keeps them from doing what they're supposed to do. And that trick is one thing that a 5/7 chord has that makes it sound so strong to resolve is it has a note that sounds like a leading tone in it. When I'm playing that G sharp, da, 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 you probably expect it to go da, to that A. When I play the chord in the second system with the F sharp, you expect a G, but that G doesn't show up either. Instead, both of those notes that sound like leading tones that want to go up a half step do the exact opposite, and they go down a half step, which is just the most heartbreaking sound in the world. It sort of takes away all of the excitement we've had that something is getting tonicized, and it undoes it. I hear that D chord with the C natural and the D, F sharp, A, C chord in the third measure second system. And I really expect that F sharp to go to G, and instead it goes to F natural. It's a great sound. It sounds wonderful. But it also really lets the air out of our sails. So one thing that Chopin likes to do is take a note that sounds like a leading tone and not let it go where it's supposed to go. Instead of letting it go up a half step like we expect, he pushes them down a half step. And that sort of denial of letting the leading tones resolve is what makes this piece have that sense of kind of poignancy. Here's another great place where Chopin plays with that denied or frustrated leading tone thing. It happens at the halfway mark of the piece at the end of the third system. There's like a real clear cadence on that 5/7 chord that sort of divides the piece in half. And then there's that little monophonic cadenza type measure that happens in the right hand of the piano when we drop the chords from the left hand for the first time in the piece. It sounds like this. Let me start a measure before and get a running go. And then we go back into where we've been. Now, that 5-7 chord, it's a major minor 7th chord. It sets up expectations. When I hear this chord, I expect this chord to follow. But instead, Chopin does something different. You know, part of why that 5-7 chord makes me expect tonic is because of the leading tone, which is D sharp. And if you look, there are a couple D sharps in that measure. So those D sharps create a strong sense of resolution. Really want to hear E, but then look at what Chopin does at the end of the measure instead. He doesn't do the half step up, but he does the half step down with that D natural. Denied leading tone, and then we have to start the whole thing over again. Like that. So, you know, this idea of not resolving leading tones or secondary leading tones is one thing that gives this piece its sense of heaviness and sadness. And it's a great effect. But I still haven't actually given us very many chords for this piece. And like I say, our analysis needs to be very harmonically focused. So we need to talk about getting some chord symbols down there. And I gave you all something in the homework to guide you when I said, what if I said provide a harmonic analysis that only included one chord per measure? Maybe you all see this when I say that. It's hard not to. So, what if I said only one chord per measure for most of the piece? That seems a little tricky because when you start looking in the left hand where the chords are, it looks like the chords are changing more often in each measure. So if you had to choose one chord for each measure, things get tricky. Now sometimes it's not tricky at all. Like the very first full measure of the piece, that's easy. You know, there's only one set of pitches in the left hand there, so one chord works real well. Likewise, if you look at the second to last measure on this particular slide, that chord's really easy too because there aren't any other notes really fighting with it. So it's easy to get one chord per measure in those two measures, but all the other measures have a lot of pitches intervening, and you can't like put all those pitches in one chord and have anything that makes sense as a 7th chord or a triad or anything. So we're going to have to throw some notes out. And the way we throw notes out from being chord tones is by deciding that they're non-chord tones. And that's what we're going to do here. So let's talk about how to identify non-chord tones. Some of these measures you can get one chord and only one chord really easily. Like the very first full measure, that's an E minor chord and G's on the bottom. No reason to think too hard about that. And actually on the slide you're looking at now, also the second to last measure, that's an easy measure to get just one chord per measure. But all the other measures are tricky because they have too many notes to get one chord per measure. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and show you where the non-chord tones are. All those notes that I've got circled are the things that I think are best understood as non-chord tones. So that sort of lets you know how to build your chords. And that makes sense for that second full measure where you've got an E and an E flat. And you can't really have a chord that has both those notes at once. So I'm saying that the actual chord in that measure is when the E flat shows up and the E natural goes away. This isn't the chord, but this is. When that E flat shows up, that's the chord. That sounds like a chord in E minor, doesn't it? You can probably picture it going here. But there's something weird going on. These are the chord symbols I would use, by the way. And now we've got those there. you can sort of see how I'm getting the reasons I'm getting for the non-chord tones I'm showing. I'm going to give you two hints that help a lot in this piece. Hint number one is this. Think inharmonically. Sometimes the note Chopin writes isn't the most grammatically correct way to spell the chord, and that's what happens in that second full measure. That E flat is really better thought of as a D sharp, which is a pretty normal note in the key of E minor, right? It's the leading tone. But if you think about that as a D sharp, it's really easy to see what the chord would be when we get to the second set of eighth notes in that measure. There's an F sharp and an A and a D sharp and a B. That's just a 5-7 chord in the key of E minor, right? B, D sharp, F sharp, A. So rethink that E flat as a D sharp and that'll make you happy. And then that means we just got to figure out, so what was the deal with that E natural? Well, the deal with that E natural was it was part of the 1 chord in the first measure, and then we held it over, and it became a non-chord tone that we resolved down by step. What are the non-chord tones that get held over from the previous chord and resolved down by step? They're suspensions. And this piece is loaded with them. So my second hint would be consider suspensions. There are lots of suspensions. There are suspensions in almost all the measures that have these troublesome chords. And a lot of times the trouble can be figured out by saying, oh, I bet those notes are suspensions. That's what's going on in the parts here, where you look in that second measure, that E is a suspension that goes down to an enharmonic D sharp. When you look in the third full measure, that E flat slash D sharp is being suspended and moved down to the D natural. Likewise, that A, that's the second lowest note in the measure, is really a suspension that moves down to the G sharp at the end of the measure. And the chord is just G sharp, B, D, F. It's a fully diminished 7 chord that tonicizes A, but you can see all these great little suspension figures going on here that sort of give the piece its fuzziness and its harmony that makes it sound so good. When we get to that third system, some interesting things happen. The chords start to get a little bit easier to deal with. They look a little bit more normal again, especially if you consider that there's usually a suspension happening in the measures. Now, there are a couple measures where you can't do just 1 chord per measure, and you don't want to. The second and third measures, you want to have the 5-7 chord going to the 4 chord. That's important because it makes those Phrygian cadence sounds. And you'll also notice that, in this system where the chords get a little bit easier and more bland and predictable, that's also where the melody starts to take off a little bit more. The melody stops being so long note oriented and static and becomes a little bit more lyrical and active. My bad. And the 4/6 again. And this little cadenza. And then we're back to our second half of the piece. But looking at this system, you can see how there's sort of a logic to these chords. A lot of times 4 chords are predominant chords and they lead to 5 chords. And that's all that's happening in this line is, predominant 4 is going to dominant 5 all the way through. A little suspension action to make the chords interesting, but that's really how Chopin's rolling in this system. 3 systems are the second half of this piece, which I call the A prime because they resemble the first half. But Chopin changes things up. The very first measure is the same as at the beginning of the piece. But the second measure, he changes 2 notes at once. Right here. That's different, and then this is also different. And of course things get different yet again where the melody does that little So he's writing a variation of what he wrote the first time through, and the chords have to be different to reflect that. Some of the chords are tricky things to identify too, like that chord at the end of the second measure is actually best understood as a French 6 chord, where again we should think of that E flat as a D sharp. It would be, you know, F, A, B, D sharp, which is what the French 6 chord in the key of A minor looks like. And it looks like he's having a little bit of a flirtation with A minor there, because he writes that thing that sounds like the French 6 in A. And French 6s are predominants, and they go toward 5/7s, which is where this one goes when it resolves. That makes me expect this to happen next. Again, take all three of those chords in one dose. That would make great sense in A minor, but that's not actually what he does. Instead, he keeps like denying us and not resolving his leading tones. And he pushes toward that loud climactic moment at the second system there, where the piano melody in the right hand, very, very rhapsodic sounding, before going back down to end in that low register the first half ends in as well. So, you know, looking at the chords at the beginning of that line, they get sort of all over the place. And the best way to analyze it is to think about that second line as having a 7 diminished 7 chord in the key of E minor. That's D, F sharp, A, C, which is certainly what Chopin's writing there. Those are the notes he has. But he also has a pedal tone of B in the bottom there. Which gives a real strong sound of dominant harmony there, because the 7 diminished 7 chord is dominant functioning. The B, of course, is the dominant note, and it makes us expect a 1 chord, which he gives us, but he gives us sort of a weak little 1 chord, a first inversion 1 chord, before going to that 4 to 5 Phrygian cadence thing he had going on before. And let's look at the very ending of the piece then. This C major chord at the beginning of the last system is interesting, because he comes at it from the 4, 6, and 5 in the system before. And you know what chord you expect next is E minor, but instead we get C, a deceptive resolution, 5 to 6, and then there's that B flat. And we get our 5 chord sounds again here, or a 1, 6, 4. This weird chord that we're going to have to talk about. And then this ending. Very satisfying conclusion in E minor, but how did we get there? Well, like I say, we got there with a deceptive resolution on that C chord, and then, you know, some stuff that almost makes sense when we throw in our suspensions and our chromatic passing tones and whatnot, and then that chord with the question mark, which is actually sort of easy to unscramble. You know, it's a B flat and a C and a G and an E. It looks like a C7 chord, C, E, G, B flat. If we were labeling it with pop chords, that would be great. But as far as what is that chord best understood as, it can go a couple different ways. If you take it at face value that it's C, E, G, B flat, then it's a 5/7 chord of F, 5/7 of the Neapolitan. And if you hear it, you might be able to imagine it resolving here. That didn't sound unlikely, right? Here it is again. That's not what Chopin does with it. Chopin does something different. He does this. which actually also sounds perfectly fine and makes great sense in the key of E minor. So it's, you know, it's spelled like 5-4-2 of the Neapolitan of F major, but it doesn't actually go to the Neapolitan, so we probably don't want to judge it just by its spelling. So let's remember that one of the directions I gave y'all was think inharmonically. So let's rethink that chord inharmonically. What if it wasn't B flat? What if it was A sharp? Which is a better explanation, because if you think about that, B flat's acting like an A sharp acts. It's moving up a half step to B natural, acting like a leading tone. And the C's moving down a half step to B natural. Both of them going by a half step to the dominant note of the scale. Usually when you approach the dominant note of the scale from half steps above and below, they're happening as part of an augmented sixth chord, and that's the case here. This is a German augmented sixth chord in the key of E minor. Instead of having A sharp, it's got B flat. And actually, if you look at some editions of this piece, there are editors who've gone back and fixed Chopin's spelling, and they write that note as an A sharp. I say we take it the way Chopin spelled it. We just need to think about how it's functioning. It's functioning as an augmented sixth chord, and it sounds perfectly fine when that chord goes to a dominant functioning 1-6-4, which goes to a dominant 5 chord, and then here comes our last 1 chord. Perfect, beautiful, bread and butter tonal progression of chords there. So that's kind of how this piece works. Now what I want to do is I want to play it again for you and let you see if you can hear these things. So here's another recording of the Chopin E minor prelude with the score underneath it so you can follow along. Okay, so that gets us through the E minor prelude. So let's talk about what we're going to do next. We're going to talk about the A minor prelude. It's in the next video, which is in the same module. And again, you want to approach it the same way. You want to make sure you've handed in the assignment already. You've taken a picture of it and sent it to me via email or gotten it to me somehow through email. And then after you've done that, go check out the video on the A minor prelude where we'll talk about what's going on in that piece. So, see you there.